I think we'll start. Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's Matthew Bishop here, and we're today doing this fireside conversation via Zoom with Sir Ronald Cohen on behalf of Catalyst 2030. So welcome. Sir Ronnie, I've had the privilege of knowing for many years now. I really first became aware of his interest in social entrepreneurship and impact when he was involved in launching the Social Investment Task Force in the UK under the Tony Blair government, which was really about trying to figure out how to channel money more effectively into the social sector. And then subsequently, I've done much work with him over the years on impact investing, was on his official, the G8 task force on social impact investing, and helped write the report there, The Invisible Heart of Markets. Now, so Ronnie, we're going to range on across a whole series of different topics and come to some questions that the Catalyst 2030 working group on financing have given us as well, but also you've read the recent report for getting from crisis to systems change, and we'll come and talk a bit about that as well. But I want to start with the new book that you have out called Impact, and just ask you briefly, why now for impact? What's the key message of the book that you want to get across to this community of social entrepreneurs?
Thank you, Matthew. And let me say hi to everybody and how much I enjoy the opportunity of being here with you, Matthew. Please call me Ronnie, as you usually do. As you say, we've gone back a very long way and seen the development of impact into something which is now very close to being mainstream. And in a way, the purpose of the book was to try to give the correct meaning to the word impact, because impact is a oft-used word, forgive me, but it doesn't always mean the same thing. And in the book, I tried to describe the impact movement and the significance of impact for entrepreneurs and for investors, for big businesses, for philanthropists, and for government. The main thesis of the book is that if we look at the world, we can see that it is shifting from just worrying about balancing risk and return in making decisions to balancing risk, return, and impact. And that's reflected in the habits of many of us on this call, to go and purchase only the products of companies whose values we share, refuse to work for companies that are polluting or creating social issues like child employment and so on. And very visibly over the last several years, the growth of ESG investing and impact investing. ESG investing and impact investing share the same intention to create positive impact and avoid negative impacts, obviously. But impact investing measures the impact, whereas in ESG to date, we haven't. And the message of the book is really for the world to shift to risk, return, impact, not just from investment, but to entrepreneurship, to business, to the center of our economies, Matthew. We need transparency on the impact that companies create. And technology has given us breakthroughs now that have enabled us to do that. And so you can now go to the Harvard Business School site and look at impact-weighted accounts. There's an open source data set of 1,800 companies showing the environmental damage they cause in dollars and cents, and comparing them and comparing it to their profits and to their sales. And some very interesting conclusions emerge from that. So the message of the book is the world has to shift to risk, return, impact. Transparency on impact is necessary to get there, but we now are able to provide it. Governments now need to mandate it, and impact will disrupt business models in entrepreneurship and big business and finance in the same way that the tech revolution did.
Now, I mean, my sense of how this discussion about impact has evolved over recent years, at least in your thinking about it, is that you want to create what you call outcomes marketplaces, and that is the missing piece in the jigsaw, despite all these other trends that have been going on. That while there is no market for the impact at the end, that money won't go there to deliver the impact. What are you seeing, doing on that front in terms of creating outcomes impact markets?
So that's exactly where we started, as you say, Matthew. And at the time when we wrote the task force report together with the other members of the task force, there were only a few social impact bonds. And the social impact bond, for those of you who are not familiar with them, I cover them in the book, is a security where the return of capital and the financial return on the investment depend on the achievement of a social good. So there are over 190 social impact bonds across the world, dealing with 15 social issues across 30 countries now. And if you want to reduce the dropout rate from a school in India for young girls under the age of 12, rather than just giving money to delivery organizations, investors provide them with money on the back of a contract with somebody who, as Matthew says, pays for the outcome. It could be a philanthropy, or it could be the government, or it could be an aid organization. And then if the charity hits those numbers, the investors get their money back, and the better the results beyond a certain level, the higher the return for the investors. And of course, the benefit to the state, and sometimes the savings to the state, or the increase in revenue for the state, is much greater than the cost of repaying the investors their money and the return on it. So that bit of the impact market, the pay for success bit, as Matthew points out, creates a market for outcomes, so that the charitable organization that can deliver outcomes can actually raise investment capital like a business. Any charity that can deliver results that can be quantified and audited can raise investment capital now. And if it delivers the social results it expected, its investors will do well financially and will stump up even more money. But the big market today is, so when we wrote the task force report, as you well remember, we had a heading, the first trillion of impact investment, the first $1 trillion. Well, we're going to hit the $1 trillion this year, 6 years after publication, Matthew. In those days, nobody would have expected that that could be possible in less than a decade. And environmental, social, and governance investment now accounts for 30 to 40 trillion dollars of investment flows. That is between a third and a half of all professionally managed money in the world. So we're beyond tipping point. And so I think the change is occurring. What we need now is the transparency for investors to be able to make the right decision if they want to achieve both profit and impact. And for that, we need governments to mandate the publication of accounts that reflect both the profit of a company and its social and environmental impact.
I mean, it's interesting because those numbers don't feel real in some sense. I think if I reflect on the conversations that have been going on within Catalyst 2030 over the past few months, as we've sort of heard from lots of people trying to respond to the COVID crisis and really the difficulty in getting funding to ideas that seem to have tremendous merit and efficacy in terms of achieving outcomes, there doesn't feel like there's trillions of dollars out there ready to flow. And so, I mean, where's the disconnect?
So the disconnect is that the 30 trillion, 40 trillion is going into public equities and bonds, basically, with a very small amount of it, a trillion, going into venture capital, private equity, loans to charities, and so on. The bit that is going to social entrepreneurs, therefore, is still relatively small. And the reason I wrote the book is that anybody who needs to raise money should be able to take this book and just give it to the potential investor and say, look, you probably haven't heard much about impact, but by delivering risk-return impact, we can give you better improvement in people's lives, but we can also, or the environment, but we can also give you a better return than if we didn't take impact into account. So there's this myth that somehow you're being philanthropic with impact investment, and therefore the returns are going to be less good. I come from the investment business, as you said, and I can assure you that there is the potential to deliver superior returns by optimizing risk, return, and impact. So the market is still immature. Most investors don't recognize the category. So if you're an impact entrepreneur trying to raise venture capital to achieve both profit and impact, there are very few funds that you can go to still. And that's our big challenge now, to bring impact to the mainstream. But as I saw with venture capital at its birth, it takes time for these ideas to become explained and understood. And I hope the book would now enable anybody raising money to make the task a lot easier.
Great. I mean, I'd encourage people in the audience to put questions into the chat field if you have something that you want to bring up to Sir Ronnie. So, specific question before we turn to the Catalyst 2030 report and some of the questions that Karen and Dan from the working group have shared with me. You know, you started out with this social investment task force in the UK that was really, I think, focused on the challenges facing the non-profit sector and how to get better money, larger amounts, and delivered in a way that was more suited to the challenges of scale in that non-profit sector. And then you've gradually moved towards the sort of harnessing of the profit motive to drive social change. Can you give a sense of how your thinking has evolved now in terms of what is the role of the non-profit social enterprise versus the for-profit as you see the move towards an impact world?
No, we set out with the idea of bringing investment to tackle social issues, and our first conclusion in 2000, as you say, of the Social Investment Task Force, that a step forward would be to bring investment capital to charitable organizations. But the intention was always, much broader than that. It took us 10 years to invent the social impact bond, we invented it in 3 years, but it took us 7 years to create social finance, and then 3 years to invent it. And then when we wrote the task force report, we realized, as you remember, that the social impact bond was just an embodiment of optimizing risk-return impact, which is what was happening in the world at large with these, United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, ESG flows, the birth of impact investment, and so on. And then as we continued to work to boost impact investment, we began to realize that what we were doing in investment could be done in business. And that if you did it in investment and business, you really brought it to the center of our economies, and you could get our economies to deliver solutions rather than to create problems. Now, how does this connect now with an entrepreneur? Today, an entrepreneur has the potential to use two routes: a non-profit, and a profit with purpose company in order to achieve a social goal. Sometimes, if you're providing services to a community, for example, and you need the community around that particular group of people you're trying to help to be of help. For example, if you're rehabilitating prisoners and you want them to get into jobs when they leave prison, you need the community to provide them with jobs. If you try to do that through a for-profit model, suspicions are created within the community and so on about your motives. And so it's more difficult to use a for-profit model, and it's more appropriate to use a non-profit model. But if you're delivering product, if you're delivering spectacles for the blind, as I explain in the book, based on artificial intelligence, then a for-profit model is much more powerful for you than a non-profit one. Because if you can have a business grow very fast, make profits, reinvest them in expanding your production, you can help a greater number of people that way than if you were trying to raise money, investment money, even for a non-profit organization. So I think the scope for social entrepreneurship or impact entrepreneurship, which for me covers social and environmental, is much greater today than it was even 10 years ago.
So you've read the Catalyst 2030 report that came out, from crisis to systems change. Any particular reactions that you had?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very good report. And for me, it was confirmation of what I say in the book and what we wrote in the report in 2014, The Invisible Heart of Markets. It says two things. It says, one, you need systemic change. And I totally agree with that. That's what the whole book is about. We can't fiddle around within the system, throwing money at old ways of doing things which haven't worked. And the second thing it says is really social entrepreneurs are crucial to make this impact revolution happen, just as they were crucial to the tech revolution. And I firmly believe that too. I think the disruption that is going to come from impact-led business models now, like Tesla as an example, is going to be just as deep as the disrupt and extensive as the disruption that came from technology. So those are the two big takeaways that I took from the book. Where I think we all need to push, if I can anticipate another of your questions, Matthew, is we have to push together for impact transparency. If companies have to disclose audited numbers about the tons of CO2 that they have put into the atmosphere and the cost to the environment relative to their profit. I'll give you an example of what I mean there, and then I'll go to a social example. If you look at the data set at Harvard Business School, the impact weighted accounts data set, open source, free, you can all go and look at it. You have 1,800 companies with their annual environmental costs going back 8 years. What's surprising about it is that 250 of these companies, 15%, deliver more environmental damage in dollar terms than they do profit. That's astounding, astounding. They will actually wipe out their profit if you subtracted the environmental costs they create. And another 15%, a bit more, deliver 25% to 100% of their profit in environmental damage. So you have a full third of companies that are delivering 25% of their profit in environmental damage. And then we will be publishing next year the social impact they create. And in both cases, it's good and bad impacts netted out. Now, you might wonder, how do you deal with the issue of inequality through impact-weighted accounts? Well, inequality arises from lack of employment of diverse communities. So you have to measure the cost of diversity, but it's easier to measure that than you might think in qualitative terms at first sight. So the effort at Harvard Business School, there's a whole paper on employment impact, and next year we will be publishing numbers for many companies on their employment impact, as well as their product impact. If you look at the employment impact, if you compare which technology now enables us to do the demographics around the facilities of companies with the demographics within the companies, you can calculate how many people are missing from these diverse communities that should be employed. And you can apply the salary levels these communities would have got had they been employed. And so a company like Intel, which has $7 billion wage bill in the US, which apparently delivers massive social improvement or positive social impact, actually sees that impact halved because of lack of diversity and differences in gender pay and benefits and so on and so forth. Now, Intel is a leader in pushing the well-being of its employees and in pushing diversity. So shouldn't we, Matthew, have total transparency on every tech company and be able to compare Intel and other companies and create a race to the top? So impact transparency is the next frontier for entrepreneurship, for investment, for government even, for business.
No, those are some pretty mind-blowing numbers. One of the other themes of the report, which I'd love to get your input on, is that social entrepreneurs feel, rightly so, I think, that they haven't had a seat at the table. That it's to some extent we're a voice crying in the wilderness, and need to be brought into the center, to the rooms where decisions are being taken, particularly at a moment like this, where trillions of dollars are being spent by governments around the world to try and stimulate economies, and there's discussion about building back better and great resets and so forth. People that have ideas for delivering systemic change that benefits everybody, should be at the table. And one of the things I've observed about you as you've gone about your task forces over the years, and now with this impact investing global steering group, is you have a very strategic approach to taking a voice that's marginalized and bringing it into those places where big amounts of money and big decisions are distributed. Can you give us some advice on how we should be thinking about that? I mean, I know Giroux, who has established Catalyst 2030, has a similar sort of strategic mind, but I'd love to get your advice to this community.
So the aim has to be for us to have a minister responsible for impact. If you look at what happened with entrepreneurship in the early days of venture capital and tech entrepreneurship, in the 80s in the UK and in the United States. It started earlier in the US, but if you look at what happened there, government began to realize that to create jobs, you needed to have these new companies. Big companies were actually merging and laying off people. And so you began to get ministers whose responsibility was to support entrepreneurs for the first time. And then by the time you got to the Blair Brown government, they were actively seeking the support of entrepreneurs in building up the economy. And, and so it needs to come from the top of government. And so our influencing government to make appointments around entrepreneurship, impact entrepreneurship in particular today, has to be our objective.
And with that, how do you go? I mean, what have you learned about how do you get that?
So you need allies. You need to get economists. You need to get ministers in the different governments that prevail today to take an interest in it. You need to talk about it in sessions like this one, you need to publish in the way that you've published a report. You need to create role models of impact entrepreneurs. You know, I define an impact entrepreneur who creates a unicorn as an entrepreneur who creates a venture worth $1 billion, but also helps 1 billion people begin to prove through their own models of the businesses and the non-profit organizations that you fund through investment, that those role models are really capable of attracting many others in their wake, so that government has an incentive to provide tax incentives and regulatory flexibility for this to happen. For instance, one of the reasons it's so hard to raise impact investment today is that pension fund and endowment trustees, by law, interpret their duty as delivering profit. Now, there is in the text the ability for them to take other things into account. We need to shift that to must take into account social and environmental issues in delivering profit. It's only a change of one word, but it's the change between Milton Friedman and the business of business is business, and the new Business Roundtable declaration about shifting to stakeholder capitalism. So governments can help in that way, and different governments have had this sort of thinking in the background for a couple of decades now. So you see law commissions in the UK which have reported on this. In France, you see pension funds that pension fund managers that have to provide vehicles where a pension saver can pick an investment program where 10% goes to impact investment and the rest goes to ESG, for instance. And these things then become compulsory. Governments push them. So I think for entrepreneurs, think big issues to solve. The GSG can help you to connect. I hope the book will help you to connect with potential investors and go for it, and and prove that this is a revolution like the tech revolution before it.
Thank you. So I've got loads of good questions coming in now in the chat function. I'm going to come to those in a moment. I just want to take 2 or 3 of the questions that the working group for Catalyst 2030 on financing have sent me. The first one is the Catalyst 2030 is working to deepen the relationship between social enterprises and the private sector, moving beyond traditional CSR activity to operational value add. And there's a role that social enterprises can and should play across value chains. Where do you see the opportunities as well as the barriers to doing this well? And who do you think is doing this well, where it's not tokenistic, nice to do, but integrated fundamentally into the business?
So unfortunately, there are relatively few big businesses that are seeking to do this. I mean, good examples are Danone, which has tried to improve livelihoods in its supply chain and diversify its supply base, and so on. I think it's a question of ambition too. I think a lot of social enterprises have existed on very little funding up until now. And now that impact investing is coming along, it's like the early days of tech entrepreneurship with venture capital coming along. In the early days of venture capital, you'll be amazed to know when I set off in 1972, the average venture capital fund was $2.5 million. $2.5 million, 10 individuals putting up $250,000 each. Obviously, the entrepreneurs in those days built their business plans around the size of these funds. Today, with impact investment hitting $1 trillion, I would say the best way for social enterprises to connect with the private sector investment companies and so on, is just to change completely the scale of our thinking. Let us begin to address social issues at scale. Now, I know that you can argue that this is better done at small scale in certain communities. I have no disagreement with that. But if we want to achieve real acceptance of the social and environmental objectives of the ventures that we have, then we have to show that we have the potential to grow to very significant scale, Matthew.
So we got the second question that I'll pick out from the working group is, your book talks about reshaping capitalism and working within the system. Do you think that the time is actually now ripe for disruption of the economic system rather than trying to, what they say here in the question, retrofit ESG sustainability in the private sector and markets more broadly? Maybe there's something more radical on the horizon that would serve us better.
So I haven't found that more radical idea on the horizon. If you have it, I would love you to let me know. Communism didn't deliver the growth that capitalism has, and socialism is also working with capitalism, but redistributing wealth and income. So state capitalism has been adopted by China. It didn't opt for going for a non-free market economy. China is becoming one of the big centers of entrepreneurship. So the conclusion I came to was we don't want to give up the use of free markets and the use of capital and the incentives that the capitalist system provides to growth and profitability. But we do want to overthrow the tyranny of profit, as I say in the book. That's why I call it a revolution, because and I'll explain why I think it will be a revolution. By putting impact by its side to keep profit in check. If the role of companies is to deliver profit and impact, and if investor money reduces the value of companies that deliver negative impact versus those that deliver good impact, then we're going to see the talent and the growth go to companies that bring solutions rather than create problems. It's a very powerful tool. It really is a revolution in the sense that if you look at the norms which our current system creates, they're around money being the measure of success. And when you bring impact alongside profit, money alone, just making money, becomes a dirty word or a dirty phrase. You have to make a contribution. Your life, the contribution that you make in your life, gives it its meaning, and then you make the money alongside. And so I do think it's a revolution, but I'm not going to haggle over whether it is an evolution or a revolution. Let's make it happen and let's all improve lives and the environment around us.
Great. And there's a question which is, I guess, picks up on this $1 trillion impact investing number in a way. What could be done to get impact capital to care more about impact? We know that there's been a significant mainstreaming of the concept of impact investing and a significant increase in the number and scale of funds. But few of these measure impact carefully or deeply, and few of them disclose the impact that they have or have not achieved. I know, one of the things we used to discuss a lot when we were writing the task force report was like, do you really need to measure impact to be a genuinely to be a genuine impact investor?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, you do. I don't think there is any more powerful lever than transparency in raising the game. In the early days of venture capital, everybody tried to pass themselves off as a technology company. And even the names of the companies at that time, if you added ology at the end of it, you somehow got a better valuation for your venture, So there are fads, but the substance of technology became indisputable when you began to see these young companies in 25 years overtake IBM and other big leaders that had been entrenched in their markets for 100 years. And I think the same is going to be true here. If we get transparency on impact alongside the transparency that we now have on profit, investors will become more discriminating, and ventures are going to have to measure their impact and have the numbers audited. Today, very early days, and so there's a lot of impact washing around. People are beginning to realize the advantage of delivering positive impact, whether it's a big company or a venture. What happened with technology is beginning to happen with impact. There are investors now that are actually looking for ventures that improve lives on the planet. And so people are trying to take advantage of it. And the only way to prevent that impact washing is through impact transparency. And luckily, our age has brought technology that enables us to do that.
I guess the response that a lot of people have to measuring impact is that it's quite expensive, and particularly, if you're a social enterprise, struggling anyway to raise money, just measuring seems like a cost, and a big cost that deflects you from your mission work. And I guess also throw on top of that, particularly if you're relying on philanthropic funding, that if every foundation, every philanthropist seems to want a different set of data to measure impact, and so it actually does become an exhaustive process. How do you react to that set of questions?
So we need standardized approaches, so you don't have 5 different investors or donors asking you for 5 different sets of measurements. And I think we're close to achieving that, even for the biggest companies, as I was saying. I think governments can mandate now that every company 2 years from now has to publish impact-weighted financial accounts, and we will be able to deliver them. The technology, the accounting firms exist to do it. The argument about cost. In 1929, after the crash, when every company could pick its own accounting principles and there were no auditors, and investors began to realize they'd been investing without understanding how much money a company actually made. Companies could even put money in hidden reserves without telling shareholders about it, if you can believe it. People screamed, it's going to be expensive, and having a single set of accounting principles will spell the end of American capitalism. Well, it's because of the cost that goes around preparing financial accounts that we have $200 trillion of investable assets in the world, okay? So there is a cost, but there's a huge benefit that comes with it. And if you think from the point of view of government, which is sometimes reticent to add cost to companies, if you think of the cost of keeping impact accounting books versus the cost that is being delivered by these companies, some of which famous household names, Associated British Foods in the UK, has $1.6 billion of profit a year, delivers 1.8 billion of environmental damage. Now, the accounting cost required to reduce that $1.8 billion of environmental damage, and we haven't measured the social damage, that'd be good and bad. I mean, I hope employment impact will be a lot more positive than environmental impact, as hopefully will product impact too. But companies that get exposed then can be taxed for it directly, instead of taxing us all to remedy the damage that's been caused by, the most negligent with regards to the environment or society. So I don't buy the argument about cost, and I think government needs this if it wants to shorten the recovery, speed the recovery out of the COVID crisis, and emerge in a better position to create a fairer and more equal and sustainable world, because governments are going to be indebted up to their eyebrows in government debt to deal with the crisis. And the social issues we're going to confront are going to be like the 30s. We're going to get sustained high levels of employment for some years, A lot of big companies are downsizing, and they're not going to re-employ all the people they employed before. And so a big push is going to have to be made to create impact-led businesses, small and medium-sized and growth businesses. And I don't expect every small business to want to become a unicorn. And fortunately, the banking system and so on deals with small and medium-sized businesses. But the businesses that are going to make a huge difference to the world in terms of tackling social issues are going to be the growth ones, which start out small, innovate, become very big, and deliver products that can improve and services that improve the lives of people, and while saving the environment. So I think coming out of COVID is going to be very challenging. And so for governments now to mandate that the companies have to deliver transparency on their impact, which has become a human right, really, transparency today, is something that I think companies are going to take in their stride, particularly, Matthew, since governments are bailing out companies left, right, and center with these stimulus packages. The least we can do is to demand that they provide impact transparency.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a big idea, and I think it's an absolute scandal that hasn't been part of the strings that are attached to these bailouts. The final question I'll take from the working group, and then I'm going to go to the ones that are on the chat board. Impact entrepreneurs of color are disproportionately hindered when trying to access capital, whether mainstream VC or impact investment. What needs to change, in your opinion, to create financially inclusive and enabling environments for us to harness the true talent of underrepresented social entrepreneurs, who incidentally also tend to outperform when it comes to the financial returns, at least in the UK?
We need multiple things to happen at the same time in order for that to happen. First of all, we need people to begin to understand the advantages of diversity within existing venture capital and private equity firms. Even gender diversity is an issue in this, in this sector, which I find surprising, but it has become an entrenched issue, let alone racial diversity. But I also think you need money to flow to venture capitalists of color, to women-led venture firms, because you have to have passion and conviction to make things work. And if you take people who have the DNA to make investment in backing entrepreneurs of color successful, you'll be successful. If you take a firm that doesn't believe in it and you have a token representative or two of ethnic minorities, that won't change anything. You need to become a lighthouse for entrepreneurs of color to know that they can go and raise money without feeling discrimination, just on the basis of their merit. And so,
and are you seeing anyone that's doing that?
I do see evidence. I do see evidence of venture capital funds being set up by people of color, but we need many more. And investors will back them, in my view. Investors will back them today. But you have to come with a track record of some kind, in the same way that somebody in the GSG summit referred to corporate management being pale, male, and stale. We need vibrancy. Entrepreneurship spells that. We need people of color now to set up venture capital firms, go raise money, and they will be back.
Unfortunately, I mean, that's the catch-22 of so much of change in the investment world, is that people will say, well, yeah, we like the idea, but where's the track record? And of course, if you're not able to get started, you never get the track record. And so we get into this circle where nothing really changes.
I had to do that. I didn't have any track record. I was 26 when I started out. At the age of 35, I managed to raise my first fund. Our slogan was, we're experts, but we're new. Like, we looked credible, but we didn't have a track record. And the investors at the time who backed us, when they were asked, Tom Judge, who led the AT&T pension fund venture investment, used to say, when people said to him, how do you know this is going to work? He said, I can't prove it's going to work, but I have faith. I have faith it's going to work. And of course, you can see venture capital, private equity is a $5 trillion pool of capital today. Venture capital funded the tech revolution. And people thought it wouldn't, it wouldn't work then. The same is true today. And I think if there are plenty of people of color working in the finance industry who are skilled in different forms of investment. They're working in consulting houses like McKinsey and BCG and Booz Allen Hamilton and others. They have skills that are transferable into the industry. They're working for tech companies very often.
So a question from Jacob Matthew, which is like social impact bonds. They are still quite expensive to stitch together in terms of structuring and legal fees. Might there be a lower cost way of doing this?
So, we had the same thing about venture capital. Venture capital is a very expensive way of doing things. Setting up a venture capital fund is very expensive, which it was. And things became standardized and scaled up, and the costs became totally handleable. What we're doing for social impact bonds will reduce the cost very significantly. We're setting up 2 billion, we being the global steering group for impact investment, is catalyzing $2 billion outcomes funds to pay for the results achieved by development impact bonds in education, in Africa and the Middle East, and in India. The first programs are just starting in Ghana and Sierra Leone, about $30 million outcomes payments for each. When you create $1 billion outcomes fund, what happens opposite? You see UBS and Bridges Ventures raising $100 to $200 million development impact bond funds for education. And then all of a sudden, the delivery organizations don't have to take months or years to find an outcome payer and to find an investor. They have doors that they can knock on with nameplates that tell them, here you can sign for outcomes and here you can sign for capital. A blockchain should enable us to reduce the agreements down to something totally standard. There's nothing very complicated about the structure of an outcomes agreement. What's complicated is the getting to the correct metrics in it. So I think we can drive the cost down through scale now.
A question from JPG. Is the only way for social entrepreneurship to become mainstream to deliver as high or higher returns than traditional investments? What about patient or catalytic capital, where entrepreneurs don't have to deliver maximized returns in the shortest time possible? Rather, investors shift their return expectations and focus on maximizing impact while generating return over a longer period of time. And there's a second question related to this from Samir Higlad. What does Sir Ronald think about blended finance as a means to deliver impact to the poorest of the poor in sub-Saharan Africa?
Okay. So on the first one, there are investors who will accept lower returns for high impact performance. But if you want this to become mainstream today, maybe a few decades from now, that you will judge companies on their impact more than you judge them on their profit. And investors will be prepared to trade one, for the other in a mainstream way. Today, if you're going to deliver below market rates of return, it's tougher to raise money for this. You can raise money. Acumen, as an example, have raised money without promising more than a return of capital. But it's much easier if like Leapfrog or Avishkar or Bridges Fund Management, you can deliver risk-adjusted, attractive returns in line with the market. As I was saying earlier, I think there is real potential to deliver high returns, and that's what we should go for. But at the same time, if entrepreneurs have models that can deliver outstanding impact performance, there's a category of investor, foundations, being one, that will look at investing in them. High net worth individuals are another.
What do you think about blended capital?
So I think blended capital is going to be part of the scene. There's no doubt at all about it. The combination of philanthropic capital, low returning capital, and normal market rate returns makes a hell of a lot of sense in a lot of environments, in particular in environments like sub-Saharan Africa. And so being able to provide the cheap layer or the government guarantee at the bottom of the capital stack releases the capital above it. So I think blended finance is certainly going to be a part of the scene, of the impact scene.
So Bram van Eyck asks, a lot of impact money comes from philanthropic capital, which is really diverting it from traditional grants and grant money that could be going towards systems change work. Is this a bit of a zero-sum game? Is there something we can do to make these things happen in parallel?
So I wouldn't say a lot of impact capital is displacing traditional grants. So organizations like the Gates Foundation have made impact investments from their grants portfolio because they consider them to be high risk. But that isn't going to be a lasting phenomenon in my view. I believe that impact investment is bringing additional money to the philanthropic sector that it wouldn't see otherwise. And I think the Outcomes Fund is a very good example of it. You're talking about bringing investment into education. If you were today to throw $1 billion of grant money to education in Africa, very few people would think you'd be likely to help 10 million children. We believe that by having an outcomes fund where philanthropists and aid organizations and government put the money in, you bring capital that wouldn't have flowed. You wouldn't have raised $1 billion of philanthropic capital for grants only, but you can raise them to go into an outcomes fund because the philanthropists know they're only paying if it works. And then opposite them, you bring investors who would never have invested because they now have the ability to back a delivery organization that signs a contract with the Outcomes Fund. So you've actually created $2 billion of flow into the marketplace that Matthew was talking about. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, what you're hoping is that government learns from what works, begins to adopt it in its policies, uses outcome payments itself, and then philanthropists move to the next challenge. But today, in my view, impact brings more philanthropic capital to tackle social and environmental issues, not less.
So Claudia Akel asks, Darren Walker, president of Ford Foundation, talks about innovating the funding instead of funding projects as a contract. They fund a 5-year period. They also launched 2 years ago a $1 billion bond that was oversubscribed. This clearly shows that there's interest for more. What do you think is needed to get more leaders, I think particularly in the philanthropic sector, to follow Darren's lead?
I think part of the problem is regulatory, that foundation trustees have got used to a model that says you manage your endowments and there's no relationship with the grants you make. And it doesn't matter whether you're polluting with your endowment, which is 95% of your capital, and you're using 5% of your capital to remedy the pollution that's been created by the 95%. That's the model. I think that model's broken, but it's existed for 100 years, so it's not just going to evaporate. You need, thought leaders like Darren, other foundation heads, to begin to do the same things. And you are seeing some of them doing it. The Heron Foundation was the first. It's a small foundation. You see the Kellogg Foundation doing, something similar. There are other foundations which I cover in the chapter on impact philanthropy in the book. But for that to become a movement, for it to become mainstream, you need the notion that the endowment can be invested in ESG and impact investment. And for that, you have a broader issue, which is, if you look at pension fund trustees, they too can't really optimize impact without a feeling that they're going beyond their fiduciary responsibility, which is to deliver profit on the investments. And so you need changes in regulation to make that absolutely clear to trustees.
So a question, and we're almost out of time, but I'll ask this question and then I'll have a final question for you. From Sylvia Caroni, in order to increase accountability, I understand that transparency and impact evaluation are more and more crucial. And I guess adding to that also changes in definitions of fiduciary responsibility. But what and how do you suggest do we improve the consciousness in the civil society world about the importance of these messages? She works in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and feels there's a long path to walk.
Right. Hi, Sylvia. I think we're going to be helped by technology. I think in maybe the next 2 or 3 years, we're each going to have apps on our phone that enable us to go shop, scan a barcode on a box of cereal, and find out what the product impact of it is and what the net impact of the company manufacturing it is. Without transparency, it's very difficult to persuade people. You get millions of dollars being spent proving exactly the opposite thing. I was reading an article yesterday about the money that was spent by companies manufacturing plastics to argue in favor of recyclability. Because if people thought that the plastic was recyclable, then they would continue to buy plastic. But actually, it wasn't recyclable in the way that it was expected to be, and they knew it. So you have huge amounts of money that are flowing to perpetuate a pitch that supports the sale of certain products. So we need transparency, and I really do think that humankind has progressed in such spectacular ways. And now it's time for our economic system to progress.
So the last question, and I'll have to ask you to be brief in replying because we've hit the hour mark. Is a practical point, anyone who wants to find out more about your work and get in touch with the impact investing world, what should they do? And secondly, do you have a final challenge or word of encouragement to this community of social entrepreneurs about how we take it to the next level?
So go to Global Steering Group for Impact Investment, GSG, and you can go to ronald.cohen.org if you're interested in seeing more of the things that I've been saying. I would leave you with the following, and buy the book and spread the message of the book. All of the royalties are going to impact charities. So this is not a commercial venture for me, but it is the way to spread the word. The message I would give, Matthew, is that In my first book on entrepreneurship called The Second Bounce of the Ball, I said, start young, think big, and stick with it. Today, I would add to that, find a big social or environmental problem that you want to help solve and create your venture by putting impact at its core to solve it.
Well, Ronnie, as always, it's been inspiring and fascinating to chat with you. And I know from the comments that are in the chat, many people have appreciated your candor and your insights. And I think particularly on this message that actually the transparency around measuring impact, there is a possible path over the next couple of years to really drive that transparency into the mainstream. That's a really exciting project to get behind. So thank you again for your time today, and thank you everyone for joining us and for your engagement as well. Onwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.